Good evening and welcome to the New Hampshire presidential primary debate. Before you stand the Republican candidates, the leading Republican candidates running for president. I'm Jack Heath, and on behalf of IMES Communications and WMUR-TV, welcome. I will be moderating and asking questions of our candidates this evening. On behalf of WMUR-TV, I'd like to welcome our statewide New Hampshire audience and a worldwide audience watching on CNN. Joining me tonight as co-moderator and co-questioner, my colleague, Karen Brown. Karen?
Thank you, Jack. And good evening, gentlemen. We thank you for your participation tonight. Let me briefly explain for our viewers the format of tonight's debate. Each candidate will be allowed to make an opening statement not to exceed 1 minute, 15 seconds in length. We will then move on to the question, answer, and rebuttal phase of the program. 3 candidates will be given 1 minute, 30 seconds each to directly answer the question. Then the remaining 5 candidates will be given 1 minute each for rebuttal. The third and final portion of the debate will consist of the closing statements. So without further ado, let us begin the opening statements. Lamar Alexander, former Tennessee governor and former U.S. Education Secretary, you will go first.
Thank you, Karen and Jack. I've walked 100 miles across New Hampshire campaigning for president the New Hampshire way. I didn't see many television cameras on that walk, but the last few days, I've hardly been able to walk because of all the cameras. I hope what that means is there are a lot more people willing to hear my new ideas about how to turn job training programs into work scholarships for people changing jobs, helping parents take back their schools with a GI Bill for kids, turning Washington welfare into neighborhood charity, a new branch of the armed services to control our borders, and cutting the pay of Congress and sending them home to create a part-time citizen Congress. Last week, the voters of Iowa said yes to new ideas, and they said no to negative advertising. That's why I've been so surprised to see that Senator Dole has begun negative advertising on television against Pat Buchanan and now against me. Senator Dole, you're better than your negative ads. Why don't you pull them off? Why don't we talk about new ideas and our future? That's the way to beat Bill Clinton. That's the way to elect the best first president of the next century.
Thank you, Governor Alexander. Next, Pat Buchanan. He's a commentator, and he's also served presidents in the past. Your opening statement, Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you. In the first 3 caucuses and primaries held this year, Pat Buchanan came in first in Alaska. I came in first in Louisiana, and I came in a close second to Senator Dole in Senator Dole's next state, Iowa. Let me tell you why I believe our campaign is catching fire across America. We do have a new idea, and that new idea is a new conservatism of the heart. A conservatism of the heart that speaks for the forgotten Americans who have no voice in Washington. That speaks up for the right to life of the innocent unborn, whose silent screams often go unheard in this country. It is a new conservatism that speaks up for the working men and women of America, whose jobs are being sent overseas in trade deals, done for the benefit of big transnational corporations that don't care about America anymore. It's a conservatism of the heart that speaks up for middle Americans who are burdened by taxation and who have to see the wives go out and work when they don't want to work. I want to represent in Washington those people that don't have representatives. And that's what this new conservatism is all about, my friends, and it is catching fire. And we're going to take it right to this nomination and into the presidency of the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan. We will now hear from Senator Bob Dole.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here with all of my colleagues. I saw earlier tonight Dick Upton, who's sort of the father of the New Hampshire primary, and I've fought as hard as anyone up here to make certain that New Hampshire kept its first in the nation tradition, and I'm very proud to be here, and I know the New Hampshire people are proud to have the first primary. If you think about it, we're just one election away. Think about it. One election away from having a Republican president and a Republican Congress that share the same vision. It's been a long, long time. And 1 year away probably from a balanced budget. We'd be on our way to a balanced budget. We'd be on our way to tax reform. Tax credits for families with children. On our way to welfare reform. Putting our parents back in charge of school and untying the hands of the Justice Department and letting our courts and making certain we get good conservative judges on our courts. We'd have moral leadership in the White House. And I want to ask you for your support. And I would only say to Lamar, I didn't know about negative advertising until I saw you do it against Pete Wilson. You ran the first negative ad in this state, and I guess maybe I thought it was hard since you did it, if I at least spelled out your record. But the bottom line is I want to ask for your support. I will be the next president of the United States. I'll be a good, mainstream, conservative president with a lot of good ideas about America's future.
Thank you, Senator Dole. Next introduction by Congressman Bob Dornan.
We always end our speeches by saying, God bless America. I'd like to begin the first speech of my life by saying, God bless America and guide this grand old party. I wish the spirit of Ronald Reagan would descend on New Hampshire and his 11th commandment that no Republican should speak ill of another Republican. Every time I've been on the platform with these distinguished gentlemen, I've said I was proud, honored to be with men of character and integrity. Bob Dole once said we're all his friends, and that if he prevailed, we'd all be in the cabinet. I like the sound of that. I'd like to be Secretary of Defense, Bob, if you make it. I think that we have to stop tearing, we have to stop tearing at one another and focus on what I said in Des Moines, Iowa. The target is Clinton, the moral crisis in the White House. Everyone here has accomplished so much in life. There isn't enough time left in the 4 days starting at midnight to sell ourselves to the great citizens of this granite state that will lead the way. Gentlemen, we're a family here. Let's unify ourselves and make sure we take the White House on November the 5th. God bless all of you.
Thank you, Congressman Dornan. Mr. Steve Forbes, you may proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Choosing the Republican nominee is a very important decision. But before you decide who to believe in, you have to decide who to believe. Look at the men here tonight. Which of them are here because they want to be something, and who is here because he wants to do something? What needs to be done for America? Government has grown so large that control of the government and control of the people is now in question. The whole premise of my campaign is returning control to the people. The reason that returning money, power, and control to the people is so controversial in Washington, the reason is very basic, because it flies in the face of the Washington establishment. Some say that a flat tax, that is a tax cut for families, is the main part of my agenda. But it's only part of my agenda. Parents should control education, not the unions. People on Medicare should control their health plans, not the bureaucrats. Young Americans should have their own Social Security system that belongs to them, not the Washington politicians. Politicians may talk about such issues, but I've shown what to do about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Next introduction by former Ambassador Alan Keyes.
Now, ever since I have been coming to New Hampshire, folks have been telling me in various ways that the only thing that the voters of New Hampshire think is at the top of the agenda is economic money issues. I think if that's the case, then both we and New Hampshireites and people in this country are in serious trouble, because it's pretty obvious that the shadow lengthening over our schools, filling our neighborhoods with violence, getting our 14-year-olds raping our 10-year-olds and our 15-year-olds killing our 17-year-olds, teachers afraid to teach, students afraid to learn because of the rising tide of violence among our young people. I don't think that all these folks are out there joining gangs, raping, murdering, and doing other things unheard of at their young age, are doing it because they have to pay a progressive income tax or because we haven't balanced the budget in Washington. We're going to have to decide, is it the money or the morals? I think all of us know in our hearts that we, in fact, are in the midst of a moral crisis. We can't afford money-obsessed leaders who will not put that crisis at the top of their agenda. The Keyes campaign is about only one thing: admitting that crisis, admitting that the dissolution of the family needs to be our #1 preoccupation, and putting it at the top of our agenda so we can deal with it rightly. If you feel that way, you have no alternative in this race but Alan Keyes.
Thank you, Ambassador Keyes. Senator Dick Lugar, you may now proceed with your opening remarks.
Earlier this week, less than 20% of Iowa Republicans, and they were self-defined as very conservative Republicans, named Mr. Dole and Mr. Alexander and Mr. Forbes and Mr. Buchanan as their top 4 choices. Let me simply say that this same group said that only 16% of that group said that beating Bill Clinton was the basic objective. A large number, more than that, thought conservative values was the objective. I believe that in New Hampshire, a majority of Republicans will vote. I think they will want to defeat Bill Clinton and have the strongest candidate. And I would suggest that polls that now indicate that Senator Dole, U.S. News and World Report, says would lose to Clinton 53-36, that say that Steve Forbes would lose 51-33, indicates some very real problems with leading candidates. Self-inflicted wounds by the top four, as well as wounds they inflict on each other through negative campaigning, have made it imperative that New Hampshire voters need to have Dick Lugar as an alternative. They're going to have somebody that will pick up the pieces after this situation clears away if we're to defeat Bill Clinton. On foreign policy and on trust in government, I can defeat Clinton. I believe I'm the best candidate.
Senator, thank you. Next introduction, Maury Taylor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight you'll hear some great ideas and visions, but you'll only hear the solutions from Maury Taylor, because I'm a real businessman. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a politician. I started as an engineer, and I've built a business up from zero sales to $620 million, manufacturing wheels and tires. I know how to balance a budget. I know how to create jobs, and I know how to provide the leadership we're going to need. All these men have very fine visions, but remember, smiles and talk can be fake. You hear about the character, the honesty, the leadership. Mr. Alexander here has broken the federal election laws by spending over the maximum amount allowed in New Hampshire. In fact, he shouldn't be here at all by the law. He signed a contract and broke the law. If you can't manage a campaign budget, you surely can't manage the federal government. Remember, all this talk and smiles reminds me of the Jimmy and Tammy Faye Baker program. It's fake, folks. You listen, you'll hear there's one up here that's a doer, not a talker.
Mr. Taylor, thank you very much. We will now move on to the question, answer, and rebuttal phase of tonight's program. Jack will ask the first question to Mr. Alexander, Mr. Buchanan, and Senator Dole. And Mr. Alexander, you will go first. Jack?
Thank you, Karen. Gentlemen, in November of 1994, your party scored a huge political victory, not only capturing both chambers of Congress for the first time in a long time, but sweeping elections across this country. Since then, as your party has battled with the White House over such mammoth issues as balancing the budget, the White House has branded you as radical and extreme. And based on recent public opinion polls, the White House may be winning that message war. My question to you, have you mismanaged the power that Newt Gingrich hailed as a revolutionary victory in the contract of America since November of '94, and are you in danger of losing the message war with the American people?
Thank you, Jack. Well, of course, I haven't mismanaged it because I haven't been there. I've been outside Washington. But let me stick up for Senator Dole and Newt Gingrich a little bit in the Republican Congress. I think they've tried. I think we just got our hopes up too high. We can't make the kind of changes that we want to make without a Republican president. They've worked on it. I would have done some things differently. For example, they've got an 800-page welfare bill that Senator Dole has sponsored. I think that's 800 pages almost too many. I'd rather cancel Washington welfare and take the $50 billion that we spend on that and put it in the form of neighborhood charities so that we could go to work helping people who need help. On my walk across New Hampshire, I came to a young couple from Nashua who'd been down to the welfare office who were encouraged to separate in order to get higher welfare benefits. Now, if we would go to work at home helping people who need help, spending the same amount of money, and if we would add to that a tax credit of up to $500 so we could give our money directly to the Boys Club or the Girls Club or the Salvation Army, then we could help every single person who needs help. What the Republican Congress needs is an agenda-setting Republican president to interpret and explain what they're doing, and who can stand up there with Bill Clinton, and when he makes these comments, when he starts believing the words that come out of his mouth, even though they're not true, can turn around to him and say what the last Republican governor who was elected president said to Jimmy Carter. There you go again, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Governor Alexander. Mr. Buchanan.
Well, let me address that this way. I do believe the Republicans have lost an historic opportunity because they lost a sense of vision in Washington. They got bogged down in the budget battle with CBO numbers or OMB numbers. Nobody could understand it, and they didn't stay on a high level. And they didn't talk about a vision and a philosophy of Republicans versus Democrats. On that level, we can win this battle every time. But you know, it's not simply Al Gore that's calling us extremists. My friend Bob Dole here, friend of 30 years, has an attack ad on me calling me an extremist. As Lamar said earlier, Bob Dole is a better man than the campaign his folks are running. He says in that ad that Pat Buchanan wants to give away, or wanted to give away, nuclear weapons to our Asian allies. Bob, that's not true.
That's what you said. I didn't say
It's
it.
not
It's in your
true, and
writings.
your folks know it's not true. And my understanding is now you're phone banking the same way you did Steve Forbes, telling folks Pat Buchanan said this. Bob, it's not true. Pat Buchanan is not an extremist. Those are the cuss words of the establishment. I'm surprised you'd be using them against a fellow Republican. And let me say this, Bob. If I'm an extremist, why are you pirating my ideas and parroting my rhetoric? Where'd you get that idea for the cultural war for the soul of America, my friend? Where'd you get these other ideas about corporate greed? Listen, I welcome the fact that you're coming my way, Bob, but I don't think you can call us an extremist when you've become a pretty good echo of Pat Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Senator Dole.
Well, I appreciate that endorsement. And, we've been talking about corporate welfare, many of Mr. Forbes' advertisers, I guess, way back since 1981. We closed some of those big loopholes that big corporations got, safe harbor leasing and other things. But let me address the question. I guess that's not without precedent. Let me address the question. I'm very proud of the Republican Congress. For the first time in 40 years, we had an opportunity to make change, and we've made changes. There's one thing that stands in the way. There's one barrier named Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton. He talks left and governs right, or talks right and governs left, whichever it is. He's never the same. One day he's this way, one day he's the next day. We need to remove that obstacle. I think we've done an outstanding job. We passed the first balanced budget in a generation. We sent it to the president, and he vetoed it. We passed welfare reform with an overwhelming vote that every governor I know of and every ex-governor except Lamar Alexander is for, and he vetoed that. We passed tax cuts for families with children, a $500 tax credit, and he vetoed that. We passed farm legislation, and he vetoed that. One after another, after another, after another, President Clinton vetoed it. Now, how do we change it? We've got the initiative. We've got the right program. As I said in my opening statement, we're just one election away from history of getting all these things done, or being on the way done, just 1 year from now. And let me say finally, you know, we're not perfect. We haven't had this opportunity for 40 years. We're going to pick up Senate seats and House seats in the Congress in 1996 if we have the right nominee, if that nominee is Bob Dole.
Thank you, Senator. Congressman Dornan, you have 1 minute for rebuttal.
Thank you. If Reagan were here, I guess he'd say, there you go again, jumping on one another. I'm glad Bob brought it back to Clinton. I'm the only person here from the House of Commons, the People's House, the House of Representatives. I signed the contract with America. I spoke on the floor and helped pass every part of it, including no U.S. troops under foreign command, which all of you get standing ovations for out on the hustings. I passed more laws that Clinton had to sign in the year of '95 than everybody else put together here, because we haven't gotten to Dick Lugar's agriculture bill, and Bob missed the great balance the budget strategy by one vote. Unfortunately, a good Republican. Let me tell you folks something. Phil Gramm said yesterday what my reason was for not being here enough to get higher in the polls. He said he's going back to his work in the Senate. I never left my work in the House. Bob may have kept Phil from being a chairman, but I'm a chairman of an intelligence committee, and you're looking at the chairman of military personnel. And later in this debate, I'll tell you about 10 amendments by Dornan that Clinton was forced to sign.
Thank you, Congressman. Steve Forbes, 1 minute for rebuttal.
Well, I think it's very clear that first we do need a Republican president, and we do need a common agenda. But part of the problem, too, in Washington is they've confused means and ends. Balancing a budget is a means to an end. And the Republicans have, for the moment, but only for the moment, lost the high moral ground. They should have been bolder and not bound by polls. They should have had vision, starting with the tax code. It is a cesspool of special interests. It is legalized corruption. They should have attacked it, I think, with a flat tax, They should have proposed a much more radical tax cut to take the pressure on two-income families. Two incomes in a family can't do the job that one income could in previous generations, and they could have gone a long way to helping that with a substantial tax cut. They also didn't put enough emphasis on medical savings accounts. They got bogged down again in the swamp of trying to cut benefits and raise co-pays and things like that. With medical savings accounts, they could have given the American people who are on Medicare more coverage, more control, at less cost. Why they didn't make that the centerpiece, I don't know. But when I'm president, we will have a common agenda, a bold agenda.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keyes, you have 1 minute.
I think what's clear is that the secret of the 1994 election was the fact that Republicans were operating in an environment where the public overwhelmingly rejected the moral culture of the Clinton administration and the Democrat-controlled Congress. The Joycelyn Elders, the gays in the military, the corruption rife in the Congress made people realize that the moral standard and values represented by the Democrats were inadequate for the future. It was that contrast between Republicans and Democrats that elected an overwhelmingly pro-life, moral conservative freshman class for the Republicans. But we've lost that. They started groveling over the money and grappling over the money and lost sight of the fact that the real crisis we face is a crisis of moral vision and moral standards. And that the choice is not just less government, less money, more money. It's a choice between big government and the strength of our families, the strength of our hearts, the strength of our spirit of self-reliance as a self-governing people. When we start putting welfare back under the control of churches instead of bureaucrats, when we put schools back under the control of parents instead of educrats, and when we finally get ourselves back under control based on our reverence for God Almighty as mandated in our Declaration principles, then I think we'll have a vision that will move the hearts of the country.
Thank you. Senator Lugar.
I believe Republicans have maintained the high ground for moral values and clearly for balancing the budget. And I think there are still great opportunities for that to occur with Republican leadership in the Congress working with the president. But I think we did mismanage perceptions on the environment, on education, on the need for a safety net for Americans who are very vulnerable, the infirm and the helpless. As Republicans, we better speak out quickly that we're for the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, that we believe in a safety net for all Americans, and we believe very firmly that we're going to have to do a great deal in education at a time when so many Americans are being laid off and so many other Americans need re-education and real boosts. Not only the young, but the non-traditional students all the way through. We've got to speak out on those things. It's not enough to balance the budget and to say we're the most conservative. We've got to be the most forward-looking, the most statesmanlike, and that will take some re-gearing of management.
Mr. Taylor, your rebuttal.
Well, number one, I think the 94 elections showed that the American public are fed up with politicians. They elected an awful lot of them that weren't politicians. But when you get to Washington, things just get messed up. And the reason being is, personally, I think they've lost focus on what we've got to do in this country. To balance the budget, the only one that can really balance the budget is the President of the United States, because he's got 3 million civilians that work for him. He's got 1.5 million men and women under the military that work for him. No one in Congress, no one in senators has the authority, hire and fire on that side. But what else we have to do is we got to look at jobs in this country, and that's a big frustration in America. I'm the only man up here that's ever created them, and I'm probably the only man up here who really understands what's wrong with our trade. Our trade, we've got to have so that it is a fair trade. We restrict, if they restrict us going into their country, we restrict them. You can't put tariffs or duties, that just hurts the working. But you can restrict it. Bring the jobs back here. That's what we have to do.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Taylor.
Karen will now ask a question beginning with Mr. Dornan.
4 years ago, the #1 issue in the New Hampshire presidential primary was the economy. Unemployment was high. Real estate was depressed, and the state still had not recovered from a local banking crisis. 4 years later, the economy is growing. Unemployment is low. Interest rates are low. The stock market is soaring, and inflation is under control. All of this coming under President Bill Clinton's watch. Aren't we better off economically than we were 4 years ago? And if so, why do we need a change in the White House? Congressman Dornan?
Well, a two-part question. All of this is in spite of Clinton and Clinton in the White House. I serve in the Congress, and I watch not a single Republican in the House or the Senate vote for the most massive tax increase in the history of civilization since the pharaohs ran a slave system. And it destroyed a lot of Democrats in 1994. We would be doing so much better now if it weren't for Clinton in the White House, that we'd be an example to the whole world. Things are on borrowed time. We have a $5 trillion debt. I believe that there are already the kind of people in the House of Representatives, the 73 freshmen, the 40 or so sophomores that are left from a tough election in '92. We are winning the victories that these people talk about. Aren't you gentlemen wired to C-SPAN? Don't you watch the quality of debate from the freshmen to some of the old bull elephants? We are winning the day. And when we take the White House back and sync up the House with the White House with the Senate, you watch this country truly grow. And then for my 10 grandchildren, and all of our children, and your beautiful Moira that I met today, Steve, you watch us begin to roll back that debt, which unfortunately will reach $6 trillion before we even start to turn it around. This is the Republican moment, and I don't know what these people are watching in politics, but I feel like a fighter in the arena, and I'm proud of my record.
Thank you, Mr. Dornan. Mr. Forbes, please answer Karen's question.
Well, this recovery has been the slowest in the last 50 years. It has been very sluggish to boast about. America has the capability of doing far, far better. As a matter of fact, we're sort of like a patient with walking pneumonia. We're out of bed, but we're not very well. All you have to do is go to families. Look at two-income families who ask that question, why two incomes in a family can't seem to do the job that one income could in previous generations. Why do so many young people feel that they won't have the opportunities to get ahead the way their parents and grandparents did? So this economy could do better. It is burdened by taxes. It is burdened by excessive regulation. And they didn't reduce taxes. They didn't reduce regulations. They haven't returned more control to the people. So the American economy is faltering. They haven't done enough to reduce trade barriers, or where they haven't lived up to the spirit of that agreement by getting into higher taxes and devaluations which wreck countries around the world. So the Clinton administration had an extraordinary opportunity to liberate the American people by reducing the tax burden, replacing the corrupt tax code, by reducing the burdens on small businesses, because it's small businesses is where the jobs are created. In the 1980s, we created 18.5 million new jobs, including a record number of high-paid jobs. 14 million came from new businesses. So America can grow much, much faster than it is today. And that's the core of my campaign. We must get these shackles off our legs, these 50-pound cinder blocks off our legs, and get America moving again. Clinton can't do it.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Mr. Keyes.
I think it's clear that Bill Clinton should be defeated because you're absolutely right. The money issues are not the real issues. Folks can go on quibbling, they can say this, they can say that, but the American people, as usual, struggling even under the burdens of oppressive taxation and overregulation, are moving this economy along. That's not Bill Clinton's doing, but we shouldn't run it down. The real problem with Bill Clinton is he represents the most anti-moral, anti-family administration in the history of this country. That he has, under his watch, seen our children increasing in their drug use, increasing in their violence, our schools coming under the shadow of increasing moral degeneracy, and he has promoted it with his appointments, with his viewpoints, with his support of a women's conference that represented a wholesale assault on the values needed to sustain the American family. If we fight this election on money grounds, it's very likely that we will lose. But if we fight it on the real grounds, the grounds of the assault on America's moral foundation, represented by Bill Clinton and his anti-family, anti-moral policies, then we will bring before the American people the real choice, the real crisis, the real opportunity to lay again strong foundations for the 21st century that reach into our deep traditions, our reverence for God, our discipline and responsibility before God in the use of our freedom. That's what Bill Clinton doesn't understand. It's what he has forgotten. It's what we Republicans must bring back to the forefront of American consciousness. So we restore the real heart of this country, which is the beating heart of our moral discipline and our moral responsibility, two things that Bill Clinton seems to know nothing about.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes. Senator Lugar, you'll have a moment to 1 minute to respond.
Well, in fairness to President Clinton, long before he came into office, American family income was flat. We now know for the last 20 years the average family has gained no money when discounted for inflation. We know that wage rates have been flat for 5 years. Likewise, productivity in our economy. We know, in essence, that we have had low growth, so low that the Social Security Trust Fund will go bankrupt in the next century because it was predicated on 3.5% to 4% real growth, and Medicare will go bankrupt much before that, and we're trying to reform that as Republicans. The problem is that President Clinton never saw those problems. He still doesn't see those problems. He may get lucky. He may be able to slide through 1996 with 1% growth of the economy or 0.5%, but he might not be lucky. We might have a recession, and there is nothing in this administration's program that would prevent recession and massive unemployment even during this campaign debate. That is the tragedy of the Clinton administration.
Senator Lugar, thank you. Mr. Taylor, you have a minute.
Well, it's hard for me to believe that everything's rolling real fine when you've got interest rates up at 8%. You go over to Japan, they're 2%. You're going to have to build more base. You go around this state, and yes, you're right. You got employment back up, but you replaced high-paying manufacturing jobs with $7, $8 jobs. You can't survive on that. We've got a minimum wage that's $4.25. That's fine from 14 to 18, but after 18, you better move it to 7, and you better get $10 to $20 hour jobs here. And the reason you can't is when they talk about the small business guy, he can't pay more because what happens is the whole market is open to the foreigners, and they'll just drop it in and run them out of business. But you can't compete over there. We can't sell tires down to Mexico. They put a 20% duty on it. It's crazy. The same with China. We got to wake up. It's fine. The economy's going great in Washington. Look at the lobbyists. Look at all the firms. You know, we got to get some practicality. And, you know, you look at the tax structure. The first thing you got to do is get some jobs and cut Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Alexander.
Let's put this in the real world. While President Clinton is up there in Washington saying the economy is getting better, at the Burger King in Wyndham, where I stopped on my walk across New Hampshire, 2 of the women who worked there's husbands lost their job in the last month. They don't think the economy's so good. And there are a lot of people driving to work in America every day worried about having a job when they get there because of downsizing, world competition, and the computer age. Your choice is which one of us has the most capacity to create good new jobs in the future. I would suggest that I've got some experience the others don't have. I'm the only governor in the race, and I helped our state go from being one of the poorest to the fastest growing in family incomes by focusing on job growth and education. And then I did something I think every politician ought to be sentenced to do. I helped to start a company under the rules I set while I was in office. I would change federal job training programs into work scholarships. That's one new idea to help people go from one job that they lose to the next job. And our new tax system ought to make it possible for pensions and for health care to follow you from one job to the next.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Mr. Buchanan, 1 minute.
All right, no one's got to tell me how bad it was up here in New Hampshire in 1991 and 92 because I came up here to protest the economic policies of my own administration, which were responsible for what was going on here. And I know how it was because I went through Laconia. There weren't houses for sale. They had auction signs in front of houses all the way up to the North Country. I remember being in a cafeteria in Nashua, and a woman came up to me and smiled and said, "Pat, I'm going to vote for you." Then she broke down crying, and she said, "I'm losing my job and they're taking my children. What am I going to do?" So there are economic problems then, and there are problems now, but the new problems are different. Now, let me tell you what they are. It is the economic insecurity of the middle class and the falling wages of working class Americans. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why my colleagues will not recognize that when you cut trade deals that force Americans to compete with people making $1 an hour and 25 cents an hour in China and 75 cents an hour in Singapore, wages are going to go down, and they're going down. And for heaven's sakes, stand with me and do something to put a stop to it and end what's going on.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Senator Dole.
Well, we shouldn't play on people's fears. We ought to play on their hopes and their aspirations. And I, too, remember what it was like up here, and remember how much it's increased despite Bill Clinton, despite the biggest tax increase in the history of America, $265 billion, despite vetoing welfare reform and tax credits for families with children and a balanced budget. But in the interim now, there are about 600,000 people working in New Hampshire. There's been a growth in that, about 51,000 over the past few years. So they made a lot of progress. The unemployment rate's about 3.3%. We've got about 1,000 companies in New Hampshire who export. They couldn't do that if you had Pat Buchanan's theory, build a wall around America, you couldn't export anything. There are people like Cabletron, Polyback, Lockheed, creates about 35,000 jobs in New Hampshire. So all this high tech, all these things happening in New Hampshire and New England are on the plus side, and New Hampshire's on the move primarily because of an outstanding governor and the legislature working together, not because of Bill Clinton, because he, again, was an impediment.
Thank you very much, Senator. Jack will ask the next question, and the first person to answer will be Senator Lugar.
Senator, perhaps more than any other single issue, the people watching you tonight at home, I don't want to speak for them, but I think if they're, well, I had one concern, it would be if they lose their job tomorrow, what are their chances of getting as good, if not a better job the next day? And as this economy changes worldwide and in New Hampshire, and companies have to adapt, and we see all these mergers going on, many New Hampshire companies are benefiting from expanding global markets, worldwide exporting. Some of you support the NAFTA and trade agreements such as GATT. Some of you do not. Please for me answer where you stand on NAFTA and GATT and how companies can grow. And if you're for it, explain why. If you're against it, why, as to what pertains to New Hampshire companies and jobs.
I strongly favor NAFTA and GATT. I strongly favor any opportunity to knock down export barriers, because that is the primary way we will gain new jobs in our country and the primary way we are gaining new jobs now. The facts are very clear that American strength diplomatically and politically and militarily has got to be combined with our strength economically to knock down those barriers. Now, make no mistake about it, there has been a net gain in jobs in our country, a net gain in income. There have been specific losses in some industries, and specific jobs have been lost here in New Hampshire, as well as in my home state of Indiana. But we have got to take a look at the future of our country in terms of all of us. And that means we are low-cost producers again and again. We are the most ingenious people in the world. Where we have free competition, we will succeed. If we are not powerful economically and militarily, and we do not have a strong foreign policy, we will not succeed. We will lose jobs if we go protectionist and isolationist. We will gain jobs if we take leadership in the world. As a businessman, I exported. I created jobs. I know how to do it. And I speak to small business very strongly in this country, and to farmers who this year exported more pork than we imported for the first time in 43 years. Why? Because we battered down the doors, and GATT and NAFTA did the job for farmers, for meat packers, for those who wanted more jobs.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Taylor, you have a minute 30 to respond.
Well, number one, NAFTA and GATT are a joke. If you've traded worldwide, and no disrespect to Senator Lugar, but he's been a senator for 25 years and a mayor before then, so I don't know when he was trading overseas. But that's the problem in Washington. They're out of touch. Here's what it is. The U.S., our market is the world's largest market, all right? You turn around and we're losing it, folks. You cannot take farm tires and sell them into Mexico. It all sounds great, free trade, but they don't read their own agreements. Number one, it says 7 years, 10 years, 20 years before they open their markets. What do the senators and all the congressmen think the people are going to do when they lose their jobs next week? Because our own government will help me close all of our plants today, 15 of them in this country, and move them to China. No duty to send the tires back. But can we send tires today over there? No. Can you send wheels? No. Right here in New Hampshire, Timberland, they make shoes. Maybe someone's got a pair on. They sell for $110 here. You go over to Europe, $250. The company's not making that profit. They slap it on. You want to talk about pork? Well, let's go to Europe. It sells for about 65 cents a pound versus 50 cents out in Iowa. Our farmers can beat anybody in the world. But is the markets all open to them? No. Only opens up when they want it. It's the same with everything. You have the market. You've got to learn you're the big dog, and they want to trade here, and if they won't open their markets, restrict them. We'll build the stuff here. And that's what we've got to do if you want to get jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Alexander, you have 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Thank you. I favor the trade agreements, and let me tell you how I learned my lesson. I became governor of one of the poorest states. We had to get our family incomes up. The way we did it was to join the world. We recruited international investment, and we got busy selling our soybeans and our cotton and our corn and our Jack Daniels and our country music. And now we're ready to sell our Saturn cars around the world. Of course we were losing jobs, but I found out very early that if all I did was fly down to Memphis and get in the newspaper trying to persuade International Harvester not to close, they were going to close anyway, and I wasn't going to be much of a governor. So I kept my focus on the job spigot, not the job drain. We also need a president who's prepared to say to Japan, for example, that if we're ready to sell our Saturns in Tokyo, the ones that are made in Tennessee, then you'd better let us run around in your market, just like we let your Toyota sellers run around in our market. But we can never raise our standard of living by protectionism, by building a wall around the country. That's not putting America first. That's putting America last. That's a lack of confidence. That's not a rising, shining America. We need lower taxes. We need less regulations. We need a focus on university research for technology. We need better schools. That's the way to have the kind of future that we need.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Mr. Buchanan, you have 1 minute for rebuttal.
All right, sure, NAFTA was really a wonderful deal for America. 2 years after we negotiated and signed it, our trade surplus is gone. We got a $15 billion trade deficit with Mexico. 300,000 jobs have gone south. The Florida winter tomato industry is on its back. Illegal immigration is soaring into this country. Mexico is the prime source of narcotics and drugs. And my good friend Senator Dole negotiated a $50 billion bailout with Bill Clinton for the regime that brought this all about. Why? Because Mexico needed the money to pay back Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Goldman Sachs. Now, I plead guilty, Bob, to wanting to protect American workers making $10 an hour in South Carolina textile mills from having to compete with Mexicans making $1 an hour. That's just not fair. That is un-American. But Bob, when Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Goldman Sachs got into trouble, you turned into a protectionist with Bill Clinton and Mr. Rubin, Mr. Greenspan, and all of you got together and bailed out that government. Why didn't you let those fellas test the magic of the marketplace like you want American workers to do?
Thank you. Senator Dole, you have a minute.
Let me say, first of all, the problem is not with NAFTA and GATT. I supported the problem with President Clinton. He's been less than aggressive in effect to be an aggressive trade policy. He's got anti-dumping provisions, anti-subsidy provisions. We have provisions in law called Section 301 where you can take action to protect American workers. He hasn't done it. He hasn't done it time after time after time. As far as the Mexican bailout is concerned, and of course this is a position, Pat Buchanan was a free trader not too many years ago, used to write about it, used to read his columns, but he's changed his mind. We ship about $3 billion in exports per month to Mexico. Creates a lot of jobs in America. Now, if we didn't have the Mexican, so-called Mexican bailout was recommended by the chairman of the Fed, Alan Greenspan, and others, because had we not done that, there would have been millions and millions of Mexicans coming across the border, would increased our costs for health care, education, and everything else. You talk about an illegal immigration flood, this would have been a flood. It's going to steady off. It's going to give it a little time to work. But if I'm the President of the United States, I'll use the weapons Congress gave me to make certain we get a fair deal in Mexico and the European countries.
Thank you, Senator. We'll now hear from the congressman from California.
Three of us who weren't ditching most of the final debates were in Derry last night, Alan, Dick Lugar, and myself. And a veteran in a wheelchair said, Congressman, we don't have it as good as the people in Mexico. And I pointed out to him that I voted against GATT because of the World Trade Organization. I also voted against it because it was after the November 8th election of '94, and 36 defeated members of Congress, big taxers and spenders like Danny Rostenkowski of Chicago, were getting to vote on a World Trade Organization. I told the veteran last night, the Mexican president who went to Harvard and was a free trader, Salinas, is in shameful exile in Mexico because his brother Raul is in prison for having tried to allegedly killing the #1 frontrunner in the presidential election. Mexico's in sad shape. I voted for NAFTA as a free trader, hoping that we could reach out and treat Mexico the way we treat Canada, as friendly North Americans. The problem is the country is corrupt under one-party rule, and the jury is still out on the NAFTA vote. Everybody here made sense.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Forbes.
It is essential for America to work to reduce trade barriers. We are now the most competitive nation in the world. We tried high tariffs in the past. We tried isolationism in the past, and we got a Great Depression as a result. America, because it's competitive, must not only reduce trade barriers with their neighbors, but with countries like Japan as well. The problem with NAFTA, which I supported, was not reducing trade barriers. It was the fact that the Clinton administration and the Mexican government neither have lived up to the spirit of that agreement. They put in a massive devaluation a little over a year ago with the express purpose of making it harder for our products to enter Mexico and easier for Mexican products to enter into the United States. That is wrong. That is not free trade. Because America is competitive, when I'm president, we're going to start trade negotiations with countries like Japan for a free trade agreement. Everyone says, gee, that's not possible. Well, it took 5 years, 6 years to do one in Canada, may take 10 or 12 years in Japan. But when we reduce these barriers, America creates jobs and high-paying jobs.
Mr. Keyes.
You know, I think it's pretty obvious that NAFTA has proven to be a raw deal. And I think that it's pretty obvious as well that the GATT and the World Trade Organization were a basic surrender of American sovereignty, giving control over our borders for trade purposes to a bunch of unelected foreigners where we only had one vote in determining and defending America's interests. I think that we have to talk about free trade in terms of whether that free trade is fair to the American worker and whether we are, in fact, having the kind of leadership that vigorously pursues the access to foreign markets that we need to create jobs in this country. And I don't think we have had that kind of leadership, not with Japan and not with others. But I also want to caution against the rhetoric that I'm listening to from Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Dole, and others beating up on the corporations, talking as if the government is going to guarantee everybody a job with the trade policies and this policy and that policy. They sound like a bunch of socialists, not a bunch of Republicans, and I'm getting a little tired of it. I think we need to go back to the understanding that Republicans and conservatives stand for free markets, stand for looking to the world strongly to open those markets to America, and that we are not in favor of those agreements that actually represent international socialism any more than we're in favor of socialism at home.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes. I'm surprised none of you jumped in there. I want to thank you. Karen will now ask a question with a 1:30 response, beginning with Mr. Buchanan.
Though the Social Security Trust Fund will have a surplus of $525 billion at the end of 1996, because of changing demographics, by the year 2029, its reserves will be depleted, and it will be paying out more than what it takes in. Some suggest raising the retirement age to 70 or 72. Still others suggest a means test or an affluence test. And still others suggest privatizing the system. Many younger workers who are paying into the system have little or no confidence that they will ever see a return on their investment. What do you say to workers in their 20s and 30s? How do you propose to revamp the system? Mr. Buchanan.
Well, quite simply, sure. We've got a minute and a half here.
Yes.
Quite simply, I don't think I'm going to need to take that time because I might devote it to something else. Quite simply, you're going to have in 1997, if you have a Republican president, Republican Senate, Republican House, we're going to have to sit down together and we're going to have to make that system solvent. Many of the ideas you've got will be right on the table. You know, I'm not going to go into which ones it's going to come down to, but we will have to do it and we'll have an obligation to do it. But let me take up an issue mentioned by Senator Dole again. Senator Dole said if we hadn't bailed out Mexico with $50 billion, why, all these immigrants would have come streaming across our border.
It's going to be repaid, too, Pat. You know, money's going to be repaid.
Lots of luck, Bob.
We're not going to lose 1 cent. We took care of that.
Bob, you're not going to get a dime of that money back. Let me give my answer here. Bob said all these illegal aliens are going to come across our border. They wouldn't come across the border if Pat Buchanan were president of the United States. I would have a security fence across all those areas of mass transit into this country. We would stop illegal immigration cold, because that is a constitutional duty of the President of the United States, to protect the borders of America and the states of America from foreign invasion. And that's what's taken place. When 1, 2, 3 million people walk across our borders every year, some of them going into crime, some of them going on welfare, most of them coming for work. Our immigration laws are being violated, and neither the Congress of the United States or the President of the United States are faithfully executing the laws of the United States. And when we get there, they will be faithfully executed, and illegal immigration into this country from that southern border will be stopped cold. You have my word.
Mr. Buchanan, thank you. Senator Dole, you have a minute 30.
The question was Social Security?
Yes.
Just wanted to check. Yes. I remember 1983 when Social Security was about to go bankrupt. We had Ronald Reagan in the White House. Republican Tip O'Neill, a Democratic speaker. They appointed a commission. I was proud to be on that commission with such persons as Claude Pepper, a Democratic congressman from Florida, the champion of senior citizens. We rescued Social Security from bankruptcy. It's going to be in good shape till you say maybe 2010, maybe probably about 2020. You say 2029 will run out of money. We're going to have to go back and address it again. We're going to have to go back and address it. Maybe take a look at the age. We're living longer. A lot of good things are happening. Got better medicine. All these things are happening. People are much better off as far as health is concerned for a long, long time. We also need to look at some alternatives, whether it's individual retirement accounts or other means to let younger people invest so they can, have something to supplement their Social Security. So there are a lot of things we can do just as we did in 1983. And there's only one member here who was on that commission, rescued Social Security, and that's Bob Dole. Let me say a thing. Pat's really gotten carried away tonight. I don't know what's happened. You have a bad day or something?
No, I know you're on that commission. You raised Social Security taxes more than any tax increase in American history.
That's right, but we saved Social Security. 37 million Americans are getting their checks every month. But Pat's off on this isolationist kick. Build a fence around America. Now, let's face it. The thing we ought to do in Mexico, get this NAFTA thing, get a good, strong president, use the weapons Congress gave him, improve the economy in Mexico, those people will stay home. If they don't, we do have a responsibility. Bob Dole will have that responsibility in 1997. And if not, we ought to supplement or compensate the states who have to pick up the slack on Medicaid, health care, and other education, other costs they incur because of illegals.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Dornan, you have a minute 30 as well.
Good citizens of New Hampshire, this is what it's like in the Republican cloakroom. Now we're on track, we're on the issues, we're fine-tuning, and we're arguing back and forth on substance. I represent a 54% Hispanic American district. It's 10% Asian, it's 1% African American, and it's Democrat by 11%. I must be doing something right. Here is the problem with the electric third rail Social Security. I hope George Stephanopoulos is listening. Stop the vicious scare rhetoric tearing up the senior citizens in this country and ruining their golden years. There's plenty of money for the next couple of decades. It's after that, with my children who straddle the baby boom generation and the excellent generation. And I repeat, Sally and I have 10 more coming up to fill in that. We must begin, you suggested, to add a year every 2 or 3 years to our retirement age. There's no reason why we shouldn't start retiring at 77, eventually, maybe in the middle of next century. Thanks to the Republicans in the House and in the Senate, we didn't let Hillary destroy the best health system in all of history in the world today, extending our lives. There are ways to fix it, but the problem is out there 20, 30 years, and we can fix it, particularly if the American voters will give us 4 years for the first time in 68 years with one continuity of House, Senate, and the White House.
Thank you, Mr. Dornan. Mr. Forbes, you'll have 1 minute.
Thank you very much. That 1983 rescue of the Social Security system, Senator, was very typical of the way Washington solves problems. They raise taxes, and they cut benefits. We need to do it a new way, turn the problem into an opportunity, which is the core of my campaign. We must keep our promises to those who are on the system and those who are going to go on the system in the next 15 years in terms of benefits. But we know, and younger Americans know, that the system is going to go kaput by the time they retire. So why not, while we still have time, do something unusual 20 years ahead of time before the crash? And that is have a new system for younger people where a portion of their payroll tax, instead of going to subsidize the national debt in Washington, would instead go into their own individual savings or retirement account. This way, it takes it out of the hands of the Washington politicians. The money's invested in the real American economy, which makes America stronger, and younger people will have a genuine retirement instead of a bankrupt system today.
Thank you. Mr. Keyes, 1 minute.
Well, I have always said that the key to Social Security reform is simple. Keep the promises we've made so that those people who in good faith pay into the system receive the benefits that they feel they're entitled to, but stop making promises we can't keep. to new generations coming along whom we know we will not be able to sustain in terms of the benefits they will be expecting. Open the system up to alternatives that allow them to invest in the private sector. We'll get a better answer. But I do kind of wish that people would stop pretending that the Social Security system was somehow resolved, the problem resolved. What they did in the 1980s was to issue license for this huge IOU, this mythological Social Security Trust Fund, that is an IOU signed by the taxpayers of today to be paid by the taxpayers of tomorrow from a worker base that won't be large enough to sustain the payment. I think it's unconscionable that we have politicians who claim that was the solution. It was sure typical. Take the burden, make sure your political butt is safe, and then shift it off to the future because you won't be around to have to answer for it. That is unconscionable. And I think to call that a solution is just fooling the American people and misrepresenting the truth, Mr. Dole.
It was President Reagan's bill. I was happy to work with President Reagan.
Thank you, Mr.
Wasn't
Keyes.
always right.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes. Move on to Senator Lugar. You have 1 minute.
Well, the solution in 1983 would have worked if we had had 3.5% to 4% real growth in the economy. That was our experience for the first 3 quarters of the century. It has not been our experience since. The basic way to cure the problem is to get growth back to 3.5% to 4%. I was surprised yesterday that President Clinton's counselors applauded the thought that 2.3% growth is the natural, that the golden years have come. Well, the fact is the golden years are bankrupting Social Security. Every time the growth gets to 2.5%, the Fed hits the panic button, interest rates are raised. Obviously, growth is the best answer. A second good answer is what Steve Forbes mentioned. We've got to give young people a chance to put a part of their money into IRAs, self-directed. And finally, we shall have to raise the retirement age if, in fact, we are all going to grow older and medical science keeps us alive. As a practical matter, we will have to do that for many Americans in the next century.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Taylor, you have 1 minute.
Well, it's not that complicated. Take all the congressmen, take the president, take the senators, and take all the federal government workers and stick them on Social Security. Knock them off their pension, stick them on Social Security, and then do like Steve Forbes said, the same thing with the youngers, set up a separate. Because you know, if all the congressmen, the senators, and the president, and the bureaucrats are on it, you won't have to worry about Social Security.
I'm on Social Security.
And, well, you should retire then. Let a job for some young person. Number 2, we got to get the jobs back. And you listen to all this talk about NAFTA and GATT. And I'll say to Governor Alexander down there, number 1, I got a plant in Tennessee, 500 employees. He raised taxes an awful lot. And those plants that came in there, number 1, they only came in because, you see, we restricted. It wasn't open. They would have never come. They were restricted to sell in the United States. Harley-Davidson would not be here today if we didn't restrict the Japanese from flooding our market. Restrict them. No duties, no tariffs. Restricted them. And now, Harley's ruled the world, and Honda and Kawasaki have their plants here. That's how you get trade.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Alexander.
Mr. Taylor, I assume you have your plants in Tennessee because it's such a good place to have them, and we have the 5th lowest taxes of any state in the country.
No,
the
I
real
bought a
issue
company
here,
that had one.
the real issue here is which one of us would you trust as president to deal with the 2 issues we've been discussing. Now, here's what I would do about Social Security. I'd lead us through a discussion about retirement savings and Social Security. We'd have to clear the deck because it affects everyone. Our objectives would be 3. Number 1, to make sure that everyone gets what they're already entitled to. Number 2, that we begin to look at new options, especially for newer and younger members of the retirement plan, so they can have their own savings accounts or whatever other options there might be. And 3, to make sure that it's solvent. Here's what I would do about illegal immigration. Within the first 6 months that I'm president, I would ask the Joint Chiefs to recommend a new branch of the armed services to control the borders, both for illegal drugs and for illegal immigration. We have to control the borders. And one reason we must do it is our failure to do so poisons our attitude toward legal immigrants who are here playing by the rules, paying taxes just like you and I do, have a right to be treated with respect and differently than people who are illegally here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander. Jack will ask the next question. Mr. Forbes, you will be the first to answer.
Mr. Forbes, viewers see a Washington where the name-calling and the price of politics and public life is getting so steep that respected people like Bill Bradley or Senator Bill Cohen are saying it's not worth it. going home to their families or business. In New Hampshire, people have been bombarded in recent months with negative paid political ads. Yes, political advertising is part of a campaign's success or failure. Not all of you are guilty of engaging in this, but I'd like each of you to answer this question. Please justify your own ad campaigns. Please comment on the negativity that New Hampshire has seen, and why haven't you all done paid ads where you talked about positive issues such as job creation, how you'd combat crime, where you stand on gun control? Mr. Forbes?
When I began this campaign, I did something unusual in American politics, and that is I went directly to issues like the flat tax to get America growing again, term limits, lower interest rates, 4.5% mortgages, medical savings accounts, a new Social Security for younger people, system for younger people, and parental control of education. I also thought it was legitimate to discuss where my opponents promise one thing before an election and then do something the opposite after the election. For example, in 1988, Senator Dole said he saw no need to raise taxes, yet 2 years later, he was leading the biggest tax increase, one of the biggest tax increases in American history. That, I thought, was a legitimate discussion for debate. Now, you see Lamar Alexander. He's now engaging in ads, distorting my position, calling me a Wall Street insider. Well, as a Wall Street insider, many of us were impressed when Hillary Clinton turned $1,000 into $100,000. But I was really astonished when I learned that as governor, Governor Alexander turned $1 into $620,000. So when he says ABC, that Alexander beats Clinton, what he meant was not Bill Clinton, but Hillary Clinton. I thought that discussing where people say one thing and then do another ethically and in taxes and spending was legitimate. But I made a mistake in Iowa. I spent too much time discussing my opponents.
Too much money.
Not enough time on my issues of growth and opportunity. But I learned, I've withdrawn all of those ads, and if others do them, I won't do it again.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Mr. Keyes, you have 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Well, you know, I wasn't guilty of any negative advertising in Iowa, but that's at least partly because I wasn't guilty of any advertising. I did manage to achieve 7.5% of the vote on the strength of strong grassroots support, for which I spent $12 a vote, compared to, I understand, was it $4,000, Steve, or $400 a vote? I forget. But it's a lot of money, you've got to admit. And I think a lot of what's going on, the negative advertising, the saturation commercials, all of this stuff, is due to the fact that we really have folks who don't have that much substance to offer the American people, and instead are trying to manipulate their perceptions with slick ad campaigns and so forth and so on. All made up, of course. The consultants do the polling, they do the focus groups, they figure out what the hot button is, and you trot out a commercial. Does it represent your heart? Does it represent your real knowledge, your experience? Who knows? But you pay for it and off you go. That kind of store-bought politician is exactly the reason we have the problems we have today. People who are not speaking from their hearts, but instead are speaking from the scripts prepared for them by what money can buy. I think it's time we decided we don't want the best president money can buy, but in fact, we want the best president that, in our judgment, can address the issues, see clearly what our real priorities ought to be, and address those priorities in particulars that relate to the things that are really happening to our children, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, on our streets. I don't see that from these money-obsessed fellows I'm running with right now, because if I saw it, they would talk more about family, less about money, more about morals, and less about the dollars that, in fact, are being wasted on programs in Washington that have helped to destroy the moral fabric and families of this country.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes. Senator Lugar.
Alan Keyes is right that there's a fraternity of campaign consultants who advise people running for president, as well as for governor or statewide for senator, to strike first, to throw the mud and throw it fast, and with as much splatter as possible to so-called define the issues and the candidate you're running against. We've all had that kind of advice. My own judgment is it's bad advice that candidates who use negative advertising demean their opponents and may injure them, but they also demean themselves. This campaign has already so demeaned the political process in this country that Americans wonder what kind of a party we have and what kind of people aspire to the presidency. Not only has there been more negative advertising, but the money invested in one state in Iowa was world class. And that could continue here in New Hampshire if New Hampshire people don't say very clearly, cut it out. I pledge not to use negative advertising. I have not done so in this campaign. I've not done so in Senate campaigns. And I've won big with 2/3 of the vote in Indiana the last 2 times because I appealed to independents and to Democrats. I said I want to unify the state, and now I want to unify the country. And you don't do that with vicious polarization that negative advertising creates. So I say again, a vote for Dick Lugar is a vote for clean campaigning, a vote to end negative campaigning. It's important to cast that vote now.
Thank you very much, Senator. Mr. Taylor, you have 1 minute for rebuttal.
Yeah, but don't put those terrorist ads on either, you know, scare the kids. Number one, I haven't done any negative ads. I went and said, hey, you want to balance the budget? You can balance the budget by cutting 1/3. You start at the top. You cut 1/3 of the bureaucrats at $143,000 a year salary. If there's 3,000, knock it down to 2 and bring it down. Number 2 is I talked about jobs in the trade, because I'm the only one up here who's really done it internationally. Number 3 was taxes, 2%, 10%, 17%. I did like Steve's line on the ABCs, but he forgot one thing. Hillary and Lamar would not pay any taxes under his flat tax program because it'd be capital gains. At least under the Taylor, the 17%, they would pay 17%. And everybody's got to pay taxes. The ads, you know, only in the political race when someone tells something about a politician and then tells what they did later, it becomes negative. It's kind of crazy, but I'm not a politician, so I'm not into it. So we'll just leave it by there, and you got some free time.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Alexander, you have 1 minute.
Well, I'm glad to be getting so much attention. The reason I did well in Iowa was because I kept on the high road. My television ads were positive about what I'm for the future, and people got sick of Senator Dole and Mr. Forbes slamming each other. And they pretty well persuaded a lot of Iowans that they were right in what they were saying about each other, and a lot of them voted for me. As far as Mr. Forbes goes, he knows what a capital gain is. I was proud of that. The reason everyone knows about that is I've disclosed my tax returns since 1978, even when I'm in private life. Steve, why don't you disclose your tax returns as well? If your tax-cutting agenda is our agenda, then we need to know what taxes you pay. And if we're not careful,
Governor, that's
we're going to
diversion.
spend all of our time talking
You as
about
governor,
each other.
You as governor have invested $20 million
Steve,
in various
interrupt.
scams that you have gotten $1.9 million returned for.
Steve.
$1.9
Mr.
million.
Alexander, you may proceed. Keep going.
Thank you very much. Steve,
Sorry.
since 1978, I've released all of my tax returns to the public. Your main agenda is tax returns. You say that your tax plan will cut taxes for most people. What does it do to your taxes? And if you're going to be in public life, you need to let us know about that. One of my ads,
We're out of
not
time,
negative,
Governor.
is about conservation. I think we need to do a much better job as champion of the great American
Thank you,
outdoors,
Mr.
and I'd like to
Alexander.
have a chance to
Thank you.
talk
Mr.
about that.
Buchanan, you have a minute.
All right, what we've demonstrated in this campaign is how a well-run campaign that deals only positively with issues and doesn't have a lot of money can carry this country. In the great state of Alaska, Steve, I think you spent $400,000. We spent about $60,000 to $80,000. We won the state of Alaska. In Iowa, Bob Dole outspent me 5-1 and Steve about 8-1. But Bob started with something like a 55-5 lead over me. By the end of the night, on caucus night, it was 3 points. This campaign is on fire because we don't care about doing television attack ads. We got a vision and an agenda. You know, in a slew of attack ads and negative ads is no substitute for an agenda for America, for ideas, dealing with immigration, dealing with tax reform, dealing with bringing the jobs back to America. That's what we got. And I think that really, that a vision of America is what is missing in many of these campaigns. When they use attack ads, there's a hollowness at the core of the campaign. There's no thought, there's no heart. It's just attack, attack, attack. And I think, quite frankly, that that's what's missing in a couple of these campaigns right now.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Senator Dole.
Well, we do have a right of self-defense in America, and I stood by from October 23rd when Steve Forbes started hammering me until January 12th. Almost 3 months I took negative, millions and millions of dollars worth of negative ads, and he didn't even use a good picture of me. So, Steve, I brought some pictures. Next time you run one, use this picture. It's better of me and my wife, good of her.
It's good.
And that's my little dog leader in this picture. He's the one on the right. So
There you go.
I know all about
And this
negative
is
ads.
Elizabeth.
That's Elizabeth.
Knockout.
Right. So if you're going to use negative ads,
Senator, no pretty picture can get around
yeah, right.
what you
I
did
know,
on taxes.
I know your problem.
No,
You've got a
no.
lot of money, and you want to buy this election, but this election's not for sale. You hammered my positive rating from 80 to 13 in Iowa down to 54. That's what you did with negative ads. Nobody else has been the victim of negative ads up here except
Thank-
Bob Dole.
thank
But
you,
we're going to be
Senator
very,
Dole.
very positive.
Senator
We're
Dole,
going to be
thank
on the
you.
offensive because we've got the ideas for America.
Congressman Dornan, you have a minute.
Thank you.
Well, the senator gave me my opportunity. Feel free on camera 3 to zoom in on Molly Una Dornan. Molly O is number 10. And I'm in the arena as a politician, a Washington insider, to try and serve the history of my country to make this world better than the world that was given to me. My dad was wounded 3 times in World War I, and my mother read nothing but politics and biographies and raised me maybe not to be the good businessman my father was. You remind me of him, Maury. He was an honest, hard-charging businessman, but he raised his sons to try and affect history a little more from the inside, and there's nothing wrong with that. I have a solution. Now, you can't pass a law for this, but we'd all have to take a promise that every word in our ads is spoken by us. I don't think my pal Bob would call my friend Pat an extremist if he had to do his own narration on camera. Let's all narrate everything we say. And don't go too far, Dick. There are comparison ads, and I want to go after Clinton. And I'm afraid if you take that attitude, he'll eat you for lunch.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Congressman Dornan.
In order to get in our last question, we're going to now say that the direct answer will be a minute and the rebuttal will be a minute. That's so we can get in our last question. Access to health care is a major concern for millions of middle-class Americans. There are many individuals and families without health insurance, many who are underinsured, who are ineligible for Medicaid and Medicare. Where does the responsibility lie for ensuring these forgotten members of the middle class, and how should their health care coverage be funded? We will start with Mr. Taylor.
Well, I think the first thing that you should do is you should exempt the whole medical field from malpractice. I mean, we can set up for people who have a problem, get compensated, take the lawyers out of it. I know that's hard for Congress to do with so many of them in there, but that's the first thing. Number 2 is you got to bring the administration down. All the cost of the layers that we have put in there from the government regulations. Number 3, we got to look at the drug companies. I mean, we can have drugs in the U.S. that sell for $30 and they sell for $7 in Mexico. That's wrong. We've got to bring it back and get it back so that it's in a managed situation. And for gosh sakes, you hear all the talk about closing the law or the medical schools because we have too many doctors. If you're going to close anything, close the law schools. It's quite obvious we have too many lawyers, and that'll help us out pretty good.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Senator Lugar, you have 1 minute.
Clearly, what we need to do is to pass the Kassebaum legislation that provides for portability of coverage from a person who has a job now to the job that he or she might take. That would take care of a great number of people, and we ought to, in the same legislation, provide for so-called pre-existing conditions so that people get insurance that want to buy it. 25 million Americans come into the insured situation and under those terms. While reforming Medicaid, we ought to make certain that a safety net is provided for all low-income Americans. It offers a remarkable opportunity for something virtually close to universal coverage. Those things the Congress can do this year. I would propose that we act swiftly.
Thank you, Senator Lugar. Next to answer 1 minute, Mr. Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Heath. I have 2 ideas. One, for Medicare, make the decisions outside Washington in the private sector, give providers more flexibility, interfere less with the doctor-patient relationship, and turn us back into consumers of medical care, not just people who get these third-party payments. Here's the second idea, for Medicaid. My state, after I left office, got control of all the Medicaid spending. They immediately extended health care to 400,000 or 500,000 more people. 94% of Tennesseans now have Medicaid coverage. That means they have health insurance. If the state governments can do that much better job with the same amount of money, then what are we waiting for? Why don't we move the decision-making and the money out of Washington back to us and let us extend health care coverage to people who genuinely need it?
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Pat Buchanan, 1 minute.
Let me talk about the private sector where people are losing their health care because big companies like AT&T are lopping off workers at 40,000 at one fell swoop, and these folks go out into the private market and they don't carry their health care with them. We got to get those good-paying jobs back into the United States, stop exporting them abroad, because most Americans get their health care and health insurance through the company they work for, and we got to get those good-paying jobs here. How do you do it? A combination of Ronald Reagan's tax rate cuts, get tax rates on investment, saving, and income down to the lowest level in the Western industrial world. That will cause America to become the enterprise zone of the Western world. But there's a second component we got to take a look at. And that's these trade deals that are shipping those jobs overseas or causing companies to move them overseas. We need trade policies, Steve, that are rooted in the ideas of all 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore. And they believed when necessary in using tariffs to protect the standard of living of American workers and to keep American factories here and to making America the most independent, powerful manufacturing and industrial power in the world. You know, Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, even Cal Coolidge, one of our heroes. He believed in those kinds of policies. You marry those two together, and America, the eagle will soar.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Senator Dole, 1 minute.
I think Pat is right. I think the Reagan tax cut, which I had the honor of shepherding through the Senate and helping through the Congress, was a great idea in 1981.
It's nice to see you two agree.
All right, well, and I think we need a president who'll be more aggressive on trade policies. Trade agreements aren't bad if you have a president who's aggressive and use the weapons Congress give them. I've got a copy of the 10th Amendment right here. We need to send Medicaid back to states, back to Governor Merrill, back to the other states, and they'll take care of a lot of these people. And finally, we need to do what somebody else suggested. We have legislation pending now in the Senate. It's going to be taken up between April 3rd, I think, and Memorial Day, or April 15th and Memorial Day, which will, portability is going to be provided for. You're not going to lose your insurance if you change jobs. You're going to take care of pre-existing condition. You're going to have what we call economies of scale because businesses can go together. There are probably 15 provisions we all agree on, and we believe this is a step in the right direction. But finally, we need to give tax credits to families with children, tax credits to working families so they can better provide for themselves, better provide for health care. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Dornan, 1 minute.
I asked dealer's choice here because it's been answered pretty well. Bob pulled out an excerpt from the amendments to our great Constitution, number 10, but I've got the whole Constitution here, and this is the kind of thing I think is fair comparison. Bob, I give you Article 1, Section 8. It's the Congress's right to raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, make rules for the government, provide for calling forth the militia, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining. Bob, Bosnia is unconstitutional. You should have had firm with me. Newt and you sold out to Clinton, and you shouldn't have done that. That young Donald Dugan shouldn't have done. There were only 49 guys on the ground, Bob. You should have stood with me and stopped them from going there. But what about airlift, sea lift, air power, sea power, all the hospitals and 100% of the intelligence? Join me on that. Please, it's unconstitutional. Somalia, Bosnia, and even Reagan in Lebanon. The Congress has the power to endanger our young men and women and send them in harm's way, not any president of either party.
Thank you, Mr. Dornan. Mr. Forbes, you have 1 minute.
Thank you very much. We can start with having medical savings accounts with Medicare as a model for the private sector to give people more coverage. Under Medicare, each beneficiary would have $1,500 to $2,000 a year for routine expenses. If they're blessed with good health, they get to keep the money. The second part of it is, above the $3,000 level, they have full 100% catastrophic coverage. So with medical savings accounts, they won't have to buy Medigap insurance, no more co-pays on Part B, and no more high deductibles on Part A. So beneficiaries would have better coverage, more control at less cost. That would be a revolution. We tried a variation of medical savings accounts in the private sector at Forbes magazine. Expenses went down, people did not lose coverage, and no one's benefits were stripped, and no one was forced into managed care. Why not have medical savings accounts through credits and other means for all of the private sector? Then we can find out who is truly not covered, and then we can have the states put in high-risk pools for those who fall between the cracks.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Mr. Keyes, you have 1 minute.
Alex, I think all of these ideas are quite good. For years, I've advocated medical savings accounts. We need to address the issues of portability and the availability of insurance for pre-existing conditions. We need to rifle shot it because we don't want a government-dominated healthcare sector, but we want one that is regulated by the real empowerment of consumers to play a responsible role in policing the relationship between price and cost. I do have to make a comment, though, because listening to Senator Dole talk about how he's going to stand forthrightly and toughly negotiate our trade agreements, I still wonder how come they didn't insist that Mr. Clinton negotiate a decent trade deal on the GATT and the World Trade Organization. But instead, with a newly elected Congress right behind you, instead of saying, let's wait a minute and examine this badly negotiated World Trade Organization agreement that accepted terms that Ronald Reagan and George Bush both had rejected. You had your opportunity to be tough, and you blew it. And now you're telling us, I wasn't tough in the Senate, but I will be tough in the White House. Why on earth should we believe you?
George Bush supported that agreement. You know better than that. He was there for the signing ceremony.
He didn't support the idea that we'd have one man, one vote determining who would sit on those panels. He didn't support the idea that we'd accept the first majority vote body in the international system on an issue of importance to the United States. That's a surrender of our sovereignty, and Republican presidents had fought against that in the negotiations.
Thank you very much,
and
Mr.
Clinton
Key.
accepted it at the
We must
11th
move
hour,
on to
and
the
he shouldn't
closing-
have.
We must move on to the closing statements. You'll each have 45 seconds. Mr. Taylor, you will begin.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say to Senator Dole, he's been a champion, a good old war horse for the Republican Party. And he's taken all their blows. They whack at him tonight. You've heard all the politicians speak tonight, but they're not listening. We want to balance the budget, and we want to get jobs in this country. We can do it. What we must do is to balance that budget. We can do it in 18 months if you cut a third of the bureaucrats at the top and you reorganize the government to function to serve you. And we can turn around and bring the jobs back if you take China and Japan and you make them open their markets. If they don't, restrict them. Because that is the only way you're going to create millions and millions of jobs. They're all fine men up here, but they're lost on the trade issue, I guarantee you. Number two, we have to do it for our children.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Senator Lugar.
President Clinton is vulnerable because of foreign policy difficulties, because the economy is in bad shape and has not been growing, and because he and Mrs. Clinton have great legal vulnerability on actions taken when he was governor, and she was First Lady of Arkansas on actions taken in the White House. The Republican candidate for president who has the best chance to win the election is somebody who has experience in foreign policy and speaks to those issues constantly, who has the best plan for the economy, the end of the Internal Revenue Service and the income taxes, and who has the trust of the American people as a straight shooter, as a truth teller. I believe I am that candidate. I believe that I could make the strongest race. I ask for your support.
Thank you, Senator Lugar. Mr. Keyes, you have 45 seconds.
You know, I think we're exactly like a family where the child is on drugs, another one's out engaging in promiscuous sex, another one is committing suicide, and all we want to think about is where we're going to get that next raise from and how we're going to get the next promotion. Our families are falling apart, our moral condition is appalling, and yet all we have here is money-obsessed leaders who think they'll solve our problems with a little more tinkering with the jobs and the taxes and the money. In your hearts, you know that's not true. And this campaign offers the moral priority that is the right one for America. We must restore the moral and material foundations of the marriage-based family. We must restore our allegiance to the principles of the Declaration, which say that our freedom comes from God and must be constrained by our responsibility to respect his existence and authority. If we can return to that moral foundation, we'll find right answers for our economic problems. We'll find right answers for our social problems, because we'll stand on the strong ground of American principles that unite us all together moving into the 21st century.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes. Mr. Forbes, your close.
Thank you very much. America has the potential for the greatest economic boom and spiritual renewal in our history. The question is, how do we remove the barriers that stand in the way of fulfilling our promise as a people and as a nation? Since the beginning of my campaign, I've been discussing directly issues that will remove those barriers, take it away from government, return it directly to the people. The world my opponents live in is a world of process, promises, and politics. The world I live in is the world of people, payrolls, and performance. In their world, you adopt a position and you slide with it. In the real world, you have to take a stand and deliver. That's what I'll do as president, return it to the people, get America moving again, and when we do, America's achievements will astound the world and us and we can move and make America that shining city on the hill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Mr. Dornan.
Steve, GOP should stand for growth, opportunity, and hope. Stay on that message. It's Reagan's message. My battle cry when I came up here a year ago next Monday with then 9 grandkids and all my in-laws and daughters and son-in-laws and my 5 grown kids, I used the battle cry I've used since 1984 in a political comeback: faith, family, and freedom. I add to that fidelity. Fidelity to some faith, fidelity to freedom, fidelity to your family. Clinton broke his oath to the people of Arkansas. It's called Whitewater, and it's multi-level corruption. He broke his faith with his wife. He broke his faith with his country 3 times. He dodged the draft. What will he do to us in a second term? Gentlemen, keep your eye on the ball. The target is Clinton. God bless all of you. I'm proud to be with you. And we're all trying to be politicians.
Thank you, Representative Dornan. Senator Dole, your close.
Thank you very much. I've been shot at a lot tonight, but I've been in combat before with many men from New Hampshire in the 10th Mountain Division. And of course, the motto of the state up here is live free or die. This is a serious moment, a serious business, and this is a defining moment. I'm prepared. I've had the experience which given me the judgment. If you're looking for a mainstream conservative with answers and ideas as we go into the next century, if you're concerned about your children and your grandchildren, about your job and about your business, and about your community and about your state and about your nation, who do you want standing in the White House making those decisions for you? Somebody with experience, somebody who's been prepared, somebody with judgment, someone who served his country, somebody who knows a little about sacrifice and knows what made America great. Those are the qualities we look for in the President of the United States. Character, moral leadership, all the things we talk about but we haven't had lately. Vote for Bob Dole. It'll be a better America as a result of it. Thank you very
Senator.
much.
Mr. Buchanan.
I am on the verge of breaking out of New Hampshire toward the Republican nomination. The sure sign of it this week and today was a savage attack on my co-chair, Larry Pratt, of the Gun Owners of America. Larry stood by me when nobody else did back in 1992, and I'm going to stand by him. I want to tell the folks out there that are smearing him, because Larry Pratt is a devout Christian. He's being attacked because he supports me. He's being attacked because he's defended Second Amendment rights his whole life. And that's why they're going after him. And I would urge the gun owners of New Hampshire and America to stand with Larry Pratt and stand with me. You know, Jack Kennedy said at the end of his campaign, "I know there is a God and I know he hates injustice. I see the storm coming and I know his hand is in it. But if there is a place and a part for me, I believe that I am ready. I believe that I am ready."
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Alexander, your close.
I'm grateful to the people of New Hampshire for this primary. I'll never forget talking about schools with the Barkers in Concord, or with a young couple in Nashua about welfare, or with the women in Wyndham about jobs. This election is about their lives and our future. And the choice will be between Senator Dole and me. Senator Dole is our most respected legislative engineer, but we need a visionary architect. We need someone who can stand up there with Bill Clinton and paint a brighter picture of the future based on our principles than he can. It's time we bring ourselves to say to Senator Dole, "Bob, we respect you, but you're not the man to have in that debate with Mr. Clinton and not the man to be the first president of the next century. It's time for new leadership. It's time to move on. I would like to be that new leader and lead us into the next century, asking less from Washington
Thank you,
and more
Governor.
from ourselves."
Thank you, Governor. And thank you, gentlemen. It has been an informative and entertaining 90 minutes of debate. We want to also thank our viewers, and we want to encourage you to be a part of the process by getting out next Tuesday and voting.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all. And on behalf of IMES Communications, WMUR-TV, and CNN, I want to thank all of you for watching. I want to thank our director, Scott Barty, and all the technical folks behind the scenes who made this possible. And finally, I'd like to thank the New Hampshire presidential primary itself for making this event possible. Thank you, and good evening.
Good night.
Now we're joining in progress WMUR-TV's 11 o'clock news.
Buchanan and Dole must slip.
Senator Dole has begun negative advertising on television against Pat Buchanan and now against me. Senator Dole, your